Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we are going to talk about the Bronze Age collapse. In the warm stillness of a Mediterranean evening, 3,000 years before our time, the world knew a kind of peace. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of balance. Ships moved slowly across blue waters, carrying copper and tin, olive oil and wine, letters written in careful script on clay tablets. The sun set each night over palace walls that had stood for generations, and farmers returned from fields that their ancestors had worked. This was the late Bronze Age, and for those who lived within its rhythms, it must have seemed eternal. The year was approximately 1200 BCE, though the people of that time had no such number for it. They marked their years by kings and harvests, by the flooding of rivers and the return of trading ships. In the eastern Mediterranean, a network of kingdoms and city-states stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of Mesopotamia, from the Anatolian highlands to the cataracts of the Nile. These civilizations had grown intertwined over centuries, their fates bound together by bronze itself, that miraculous alloy that gave the age its name. Bronze required copper and tin, and no single kingdom possessed both in abundance. This simple fact of geology had woven the Bronze Age world into a tapestry of trade. The Mycenaean Greeks controlled fortress cities in the Peloponnese, their cyclopean walls rising above terraced hillsides. The Hittites ruled from their mountain capital in central Anatolia, their empire stretching across what we now call Turkey, Egypt, ancient even then, flourished under powerful pharaohs, its black soil renewing itself each year with the Nile's floods. Along the Levantine coast, merchant cities like Ugarit and Byblos served as meeting points where cultures mingled and goods changed hands. In these cities, scribes kept records on clay tablets, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay that would harden into permanence. They recorded grain deliveries and tax payments, diplomatic marriages and treaty obligations, the arrival of merchant ships, and the departure of emissaries. These tablets would survive in palace archives, baked hard by the fires that would eventually consume the buildings housing them, preserving for us a glimpse of a world about to end. But on a quiet evening in 1225 BCE, no one knew what was coming. In the harbour at Ugarit, ships rocked gently at anchor, their holds full of copper ingots from Cyprus, each one marked with the sign of its maker. In the palace, the king perhaps sat in his reception hall, the walls painted with scenes of hunting and feasting. Oil lamps flickered in bronze stands, casting soft shadows. The stones beneath his feet, fitted together without mortar in the ancient way, still held the warmth of the day's sun. Further east, in the Hittite capital of Hattusa, guards walked the circuit of walls that ran for miles around the upper and lower cities. The great stone lions that flanked the King's Gate stared eternally outward, their features worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Inside the citadel, the great temple complex lay quiet in the darkness, its many storerooms full of grain and oil, the surplus of a well-ordered empire. The Hittite kings had ruled here for 400 years, their power acknowledged from the Mediterranean coast to the upper Euphrates. In Egypt's delta, in the great capital of Pi-Ramesses, built by Ramesses II decades earlier, The palace compound stretched across the landscape, a city within a city. The walls were covered in glazed tiles that caught the morning light, blue and green and gold. Gardens grew in careful rows, irrigated by channels that brought Nile water to date the palms and sycamore trees. The granaries were full, as they had been for generations. Egypt had weathered invasions before. It had seen empires rise and fall along its borders, while the Nile continued its eternal rhythm, flood and harvest, year after year, as predictable as the stars. The Bronze Age world was not without its problems, of course. No age is perfect, even in memory. There were droughts sometimes, and years when the harvest fell short. There were wars between kingdoms, raids by mountain tribes, pirates in the waters between islands. But these were troubles that fit within an understood pattern. Kings knew how to respond to drought with stored grain. Armies knew how to march against raiders. The patterns held. What made the Late Bronze Age remarkable was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of systems that could manage trouble. When famine threatened one kingdom, grain could be requested from another. When pirates raided, naval patrols could be coordinated between neighboring powers. Letters traveled between royal courts, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, carried by messengers who knew the roads and sea routes, who could expect hospitality at each stop along the way. This interconnection ran deeper than diplomacy. Royal families intermarried across kingdoms, creating bonds of kinship that tangled the family trees of empires. A Hittite prince might marry a Babylonian princess. An Egyptian princess might be sent to a Hittite king. These marriages were recorded in letters between courts, negotiations over dowries and escorts, about suitable accommodation and proper honors. The letters reveal a world where kings addressed each other as brothers, where a delay in sending promised gold or the quality of gifts given could spark long exchanges of increasingly testy correspondence. The archaeological evidence shows us layers of occupation at major sites, walls built atop earlier walls, palaces reconstructed in more elaborate forms. At Mycenae, the great citadel on its hill had been expanded and reinforced over generations. The Lion Gate, with its massive stone lions in relief above the entrance, was a relatively recent addition, built perhaps a century before our story begins inside the citadel. The palace complex contained rooms for administration, storage, religious ceremony, and the king's household. The Megaron, the great hall where the king received visitors and presided over feasts, had a central hearth surrounded by 4 columns, its walls covered in painted plaster, showing processions and battles. In workshops attached to palaces, craftsmen practiced their trades. Bronze smiths heated copper and tin in crucibles, pouring the molten metal into molds to create weapons and tools, vessels and jewelry. Potters shaped clay on wheels, creating storage jars tall as a man, decorated with octopi and nautili, abstract patterns and scenes from nature. Scribes learned to write, copying out traditional texts, studying the signs that recorded their language. In Egypt, artists painted tomb walls with scenes of daily life, capturing farmers in the fields, fishermen on the Nile, craftsmen at their work, creating an eternal record of a living world. The night air in these Bronze Age cities carried different sounds than we know now. No engines, no electricity, no hum of modern machinery. Instead, perhaps the lowing of cattle in pens near the palace, the bark of a dog somewhere in the lower town, the footsteps of a guard on stone pavement. Smoke rose from hearth fires, carrying the smell of cooking grain, roasted meat, olive oil warming in lamps. The stars overhead were the same stars we see now, though in that darker world, unpolluted by artificial light, they must have blazed with an intensity hard for us to imagine. In these quiet hours, the priests in temples made their offerings to gods whose names we still know. In Greece, Zeus and Poseidon, Athena and Artemis. In Anatolia, the storm god Tarhuna and the sun goddess Arina. In Egypt, Amun-Ra and Osiris, Isis and Horus. These gods received libations of wine and oil, offerings of bread and meat, prayers spoken in languages ancient even then. The gods were believed to dwell in their temples, their statues housed in inner sanctums, fed and clothed by priests who served them as they would serve an earthly king. The religion of the Bronze Age was fundamentally practical. Gods were asked for specific favors, for good harvests and victory in war, for health and children. Treaties between kings were sworn before gods, who were called upon to witness oaths and punish those who broke them. When disaster struck, it was understood as divine anger, and rituals were performed to determine what the gods wanted, what had been done wrong, how their favor could be restored. But on this particular evening, wherever we place it in the years before the collapse, the gods seemed satisfied. The harvest had been adequate. No enemy army threatened the borders. The storerooms held enough for the winter ahead. In a palace courtyard somewhere, perhaps in Pylos or Tiryns, someone played a lyre, its strings plucked in a melody that has not survived. Others might have listened, or perhaps no one paid particular attention. Music was for the moment, not for memory. The children of that evening, if any survived what was coming, would grow old in a different world. They would tell their grandchildren about the time before, when the great palaces stood, when ships came regularly to the harbors, when the merchants brought tin and the workshops produced fine bronze. Those grandchildren would listen with the skepticism that grandchildren always have for stories of past glory. The ruins would stand on the hills, stone walls too massive to move, serving as sheep pens and landmarks, their purpose half forgotten. But that was all to come. On this evening, the stones were still fitted perfectly together. The frescoes were still bright on the walls. The bronze hinges on the palace doors still moved smoothly. The ships in the harbor would sail again when the season came. Farmers planned their planting for the spring. Merchants calculated profits from the summer's trading. Scribes recorded it all, pressing their careful marks into clay, creating records that would last 3,000 years. The sea that night was calm, its surface reflecting starlight. The Mediterranean in summer is often peaceful, its waters warm, its winds gentle. Ships could navigate by the stars, hopping from island to island, never out of sight of land for long. The sea routes were well known, passed down from captain to captain. Everyone knew how many days from Rhodes to Cyprus, from Cyprus to the Levantine coast, from Ugarit north to the Cilician ports, or south to Egypt. On these routes, the great merchant vessels moved slowly, powered by sail when the wind served, by oars when it didn't. They were heavy ships, built to carry bulk cargo, copper ingots and grain, wine and oil in large storage jars called pithoi. Some of these ships have been found by underwater archaeologists, preserved by the mud of the sea floor. The most famous, discovered off Cape Gelidonia and at Uluburun, both off the coast of Turkey, give us an extraordinary glimpse of Bronze Age trade. The Uluburun shipwreck, dated to around 1300 BCE, carried 10 tons of copper ingots, a ton of tin ingots, glass ingots, ebony logs from Africa, ivory, ostrich eggshells, pottery from multiple cultures, jewelry, weapons, scarabs, a gold chalice. The cargo represented the trade network of the entire eastern Mediterranean, goods from Egypt and Africa, from Cyprus and the Levantine coast, from Mycenaean Greece and possibly Sardinia. All of this wealth went down in a single storm, the ship perhaps caught on a lee shore, unable to claw off the rocks. But most ships completed their voyages, most cargoes were delivered, most merchants returned home with their profits. The system worked. It had worked for centuries. The oldest trade routes were ancient beyond memory. Obsidian from the island of Melos had been traded to mainland Greece in the Neolithic period, thousands of years before bronze. The patterns of exchange were older than writing, older than cities, older than kingdoms. On this evening, somewhere in that network, the last peaceful season was ending. The signals were there, perhaps, for those who knew how to read them. The Hittite king's letters show increasing concern about grain supplies, requests for shipments from Egypt and elsewhere. Raids on coastal cities had been reported, groups of attackers coming by sea, their origins unclear. There had been earthquakes, damaging cities, requiring repairs. Drought had affected some regions, forcing movement of peoples. But none of these things were unprecedented. There had been droughts before. There had been raids before. There had been earthquakes before. Each problem had a known solution. Send grain, send soldiers, repair the walls. The mechanisms existed to handle crisis. The experience of centuries suggested that the system would hold. In the deep archives beneath palaces, in rooms we can now walk through as tourists at sites like Pylos, clay tablets filled shelves, an accounting of a complex world, these tablets recorded everything. How many bronze smiths worked in the palace? How many women were employed in textile production? How much grain was distributed to workers? Which villages owed which obligations? Which gods received which offerings? The bureaucracy of the Bronze Age was meticulous, creating records in such detail that modern scholars can reconstruct the economy, calculate populations, trace trade networks. The scribes who created these tablets were specialists, trained from childhood in the complex writing systems of their cultures. In Greece, the Linear B script recorded an early form of Greek, but it was used only for administrative purposes, not for literature or letters. Each palace had its own scribes, its own archive. When the palaces fell, the scribal tradition died with them. The knowledge of reading and writing would eventually return to Greece centuries later, borrowing the alphabet from Phoenician traders. But that was centuries away. On this evening, a scribe in Pylos perhaps worked late, finishing the day's accounting by oil lamp. The figures had to add up. Every item had to be recorded. The system depended on accuracy. When the figures were complete, the tablet would be set aside to dry, joining thousands of others in the archive room. If a tablet was no longer needed, it could be wetted and reused, the clay reformed, the old information literally erased. But the important records were kept, dried hard, filed in order. These administrative tablets give us something precious, a view into daily life at the very end. One tablet from Pylos, dated to the final year of the palace, records the preparation of coastal defences. Watchers were being posted at points along the coast. Rowers were being sent to a place called Pleuron. The record is terse, just the facts, but it suggests awareness of danger, preparation for something coming by sea. Whether this preparation succeeded, we don't know. What we know is that Pylos burned shortly after this tablet was written, the palace destroyed so completely that it was never rebuilt. But before that fire, before that ending, there was this evening. There was the ordinary continuity of life. There were children learning the tasks they would need as adults. There were farmers checking the sky for rain. There were merchants planning next season's voyage. There were priestesses preparing offerings for tomorrow's ritual. There were old people remembering the days of their youth, when things were somehow better, as old people always remember. The Bronze Age world, for all its sophistication, was still an agricultural world, dependent on the harvest, on the weather, on the seasons. Most people worked the land, living in small villages, their lives regulated by planting and harvest, by the demands of the palace for taxes and labor. The great palaces and their scribes represented a thin layer of complexity atop this agricultural base. If that layer failed, the farmers would still be there, still working the land. Life would continue, though in a simpler form. The sea received the last light of day, turning from blue to dark, purple to black. The stars emerged one by one, first the brightest, then the dimmer ones as the sky darkened fully. Venus, the evening star, brilliant in the west, the constellations that guided sailors, the patterns that marked the seasons. The moon, if it was in the sky that particular evening, casting its silver light on waves, on stone walls, on the faces of those who stood outside to catch the cooler air after the heat of the day. In this moment, balanced between day and night, between the secure past and the unknown future, the Bronze Age world stood complete. Everything that would be lost was still there. Every skill that would be forgotten was still practiced. Every city that would burn still stood. Every ship that would sink still sailed. Every person who would die still lived. The peace of that evening was real, even if temporary. The beauty of the painted walls was real. The satisfaction of a successful harvest was real. The love between parents and children, the friendship between companions, the pride of a craftsman in his work, all of this was real. When we remember the Bronze Age collapse, we often focus on the ending, on the destruction and loss. But before the ending, there was all of this. There were lifetimes of ordinary days, of small joys and familiar sorrows, of work and rest, of songs sung and stories told. The night deepened. The fires burned low. One by one, the lights in the palace windows went dark. People slept in the rooms where their parents had slept, in houses where generations had lived. They slept without knowing that they were living through the final chapter of an age. They slept as we sleep, assuming that tomorrow would be much like today, that the patterns of life would continue, that the world they knew would still be there when they woke. And for a while longer, it was. Bronze itself was a kind of miracle, though the people who worked with it daily might not have thought of it that way. Copper alone is too soft for most practical uses, bending when it should hold firm. But mix copper with tin, roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. Heat it until both metals melt together and something transforms. The resulting alloy is harder than either metal alone, hard enough to hold an edge, strong enough to make tools and weapons that changed human capability. The discovery of bronze working, lost in the depths of a prehistory, must have seemed like magic when it first happened. Someone, somewhere, mixed the two metals, perhaps by accident, perhaps through deliberate experimentation. The result was revolutionary. Bronze tools could fell trees more efficiently than stone. Bronze weapons could penetrate leather armor. Bronze could be cast into complex shapes, melted and poured into molds, allowed to cool into the desired form. It could be worked while hot, hammered into sheets, shaped into vessels. The Bronze Age began at different times in different places, spreading outward from centers of innovation. In the Near East, bronze working was well established. By 3000 BCE in the Aegean, bronze appears around 2800 BCE. By the Late Bronze Age, the period of our story, bronze working had been refined over more than 1,000 years. Master craftsmen knew the exact proportions needed for different purposes. Weapons required a harder bronze, with slightly more tin. Vessels could use softer bronze, easier to work. The workshops where bronze was produced were attached to palaces, their output controlled by the state. At Knossos in Crete, archaeologists found stores of copper and tin ingots carefully inventoried at Pylos. The Linear B tablets record the distribution of bronze to smiths, measured in precise amounts, with the finished products expected in return. A smith might receive enough bronze to make a specific number of spearheads or swords, and would be held accountable for the result. Copper was relatively common in the ancient world. Cyprus, the island that may have taken its name from copper or given its name to the metal, had rich deposits of copper ore. The island's mines had been worked for centuries, their output feeding the bronze workshops of the Mediterranean. The copper ingots carried on Bronze Age ships were distinctive in shape, flat rectangles with protruding handles at the corners, looking somewhat like an oxide hide. These ingots, weighing about 60 pounds each, were a standard form of trade good, their weight and purity guaranteed by maker's marks stamped into the metal. But tin was rare. This was the critical constraint of the Bronze Age economy. Copper might be found in many places, but tin deposits were few and far between. The major source known to the Bronze Age Mediterranean world was probably somewhere in Central Asia, possibly Afghanistan or the region around Uzbekistan. Other sources may have existed in Anatolia or Iberia, but the evidence is uncertain. What is clear is that tin had to travel long distances to reach the bronze workshops. The trade routes that brought tin to the Mediterranean were long and complex, passing through many hands. Tin from Afghanistan might travel west through Mesopotamia, carried by merchants who knew the roads between cities, who could negotiate passage through different kingdoms, who knew where they would be welcome and where they should avoid. Some tin might come by sea, shipped down the Persian Gulf, and then west along the Arabian coast. The exact routes remain uncertain. But the tin arrived century after century, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age economy. The dependency this created was profound. Without tin, bronze could not be made. Without bronze, the military superiority of the great kingdoms would evaporate. Bronze weapons were far superior to anything that could be made from stone or pure copper. An army without bronze weapons would be at a deadly disadvantage against an army that had them. Similarly, bronze tools enabled agriculture at a scale that could not be maintained otherwise. Large territories could be farmed efficiently, producing the surplus that supported cities and palaces. This dependency explains why trade was so important, why the kingdoms of the late Bronze Age maintained such careful diplomatic relationships. Everyone needed the trade routes to remain open. Everyone needed ships to sail safely. Everyone needed merchants to continue their business. When we read the letters between kings found in the diplomatic archives of Egypt and Anatolia, we see this concern constantly. Kings requested copper and tin from each other, sometimes as gifts, sometimes as purchases, always with an eye to maintaining the supply. The metal itself could be recycled. Old bronze objects could be melted down and recast into new forms. Broken weapons could become new weapons. Worn tools could become new tools. At many palace sites, archaeologists have found hoards of bronze scrap, old and broken objects stored for recycling, but recycling could not create new metal. To expand bronze production, to arm more soldiers, to make more tools, new copper and new tin were needed. The late Bronze Age world had achieved a remarkable level of material prosperity based on this foundation of bronze. The palaces were large and elaborate, the cities spread across hillsides and plains. Population had grown to levels that would not be reached again for centuries after the collapse. This growth was made possible by agricultural surplus, which was made possible by bronze tools, which was made possible by trade. The storage facilities in Bronze Age palaces were vast. At Knossos, the palace had enormous storerooms filled with pithoi, great storage jars, each one tall enough to hold a person. These jars contained olive oil and wine, grain and legumes, all the produce collected as tax or tribute from the surrounding countryside. Similar storerooms existed at every major palace site. The accumulation and distribution of these stores was a primary function of palace administration. The economy operated on a redistributive model. Farmers and craftsmen owed portions of their production to the palace. The palace collected these goods and redistributed them, feeding its workers, paying its soldiers, supporting its scribes and administrators. The system was not money-based. There was coinage in some parts of the Near East, but the Mycenaean Greeks didn't use money. Instead, everything operated on credit and obligation, carefully recorded on clay tablets. The sophistication of this administrative system should not be underestimated. The Linear B tablets show that palace officials tracked hundreds of different products, from major items like bronze and grain, down to specific spices and perfumed oils. They recorded the names of workers, organized into groups by their specialty. They tracked livestock, noting how many animals each shepherd was responsible for. They recorded land holdings, noting which plots owed which obligations. This level of bureaucracy required literacy, which required schools, which required teachers, which required a system of education that could produce a steady supply of trained scribes. The scribes formed a specialized class, essential to the functioning of the state. They learned not only to read and write, but to calculate, to keep accounts, to understand the complex obligations and relationships that bound the palace economy together. Beyond the palace workshops, independent craftsmen also worked, though less is known about them. In the lower towns around palace citadels, archaeologists have found evidence of workshops producing pottery, textiles, and other goods. These craftsmen may have worked partly for the palace and partly for private clients, though the exact relationship is unclear. What is clear is that the economy was complex, with multiple levels of production and exchange. Trade extended far beyond the basic necessities of bronze production. The Uluburun shipwreck mentioned earlier carried luxury goods as well as raw materials. There was glass, probably from workshops in Egypt or the Levantine coast, formed into ingots that could be melted and reworked. There was ebony from Africa, a valuable wood, dark and dense, used for luxury furniture and decorative items. There was ivory, from elephant and hippopotamus, carved into cosmetic boxes and game boards. There were ostrich eggs, prized for their size and used as containers or decorative objects. These luxury goods moved through the same trade networks as the essential materials, carried on the same ships, handled by the same merchants. The distinction between necessity and luxury, always somewhat artificial, was even more blurred in the Bronze Age economy. A ship might carry copper ingots essential for bronze production, alongside glass ingots desired for decorative work. Both had value. Both justified the cost and risk of a trading voyage. The ships themselves represented substantial investments. Building a vessel capable of carrying several tons of cargo required specialized knowledge and significant resources. The hull had to be strong enough to withstand storms, shaped correctly to sail efficiently, fitted with masts and rigging. The Uluburun ship was about 50 feet long, built of cedar planks joined with mortise and tenon joints, a sophisticated technique that created a strong, flexible hull. Such ships took months to build and required experienced shipwrights. Sailing such ships required skill and knowledge. Captains had to know the routes, the seasonal winds, the locations of safe harbors. They had to judge weather, navigate by stars and landmarks, manage their crew. The risks were real. Storms could sink even well-built ships. Pirates operated in some waters, preying on merchant vessels. Rocks and reefs claimed ships whose captains miscalculated. But the rewards justified the risks. A successful trading voyage could bring substantial profit. The merchants who financed these expeditions, whether palace officials or independent operators, could accumulate wealth. Some of this wealth was recycled into the economy, building houses, purchasing goods, supporting dependents. Some was hoarded, buried in times of danger, occasionally lost forever, occasionally found by archaeologists thousands of years later. The movement of goods created movement of ideas. A merchant who travelled from Mycenae to Cyprus to Ugarit would see different styles of architecture, different pottery forms, different ways of organizing cities. Craftsmen in one region would see objects from another region and adapt ideas to their own work. We can trace these influences in the archaeological record. Mycenaean pottery appears in Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levantine coast. Egyptian scarabs appear in Greece. Hittite cylinder seals appear in many locations. Each object that travelled carried with it a piece of its culture of origin. Writing systems spread through similar processes. The cuneiform script, originally developed in Mesopotamia, was adapted to write multiple languages. Akkadian, written in cuneiform, became the diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age, used in correspondence between kingdoms, even when neither party spoke Akkadian as their native language. The clay tablets found at Amarna in Egypt, the diplomatic archive of Pharaoh Akhenaten, are written in Akkadian. Letters from Hittite kings and Levantine city rulers to the Egyptian court. The alphabetic script, ancestor of our own writing system, was developed in the Levantine coast during the Late Bronze Age, probably by Canaanite speakers. This script, much simpler than cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, used a small set of signs to represent individual sounds rather than syllables or whole words. The earliest known examples come from the city of Ugarit, where scribes used a cuneiform alphabet to write their local language. This innovation would eventually transform writing, making it accessible beyond specialized scribal classes. But that transformation would come later. The Late Bronze Age Mediterranean was, in many ways, a cosmopolitan world. At Ugarit, a coastal city in what is now Syria, excavators found texts in 8 different languages using 5 different scripts. The city was a crossroads, a place where Egyptian officials mingled with Hittite merchants, where Mycenaean pottery filled the households of the wealthy, where ships from Cyprus unloaded copper and loaded timber. The city's scribes were multilingual, able to draft documents in whatever language a client needed. In this interconnected world, the city of Ugarit represented both the possibilities and the vulnerabilities of the system. Its prosperity depended on trade, on the ships that came to its harbour, on the caravans that connected it to inland cities. Its cultural richness came from its position as a meeting point. But this also meant it had no hinterland to retreat to, no deep territories that could sustain it if trade failed. Ugarit existed at the intersection of networks. When those networks broke down, Ugarit would be exposed. The evening light in Ugarit must have been beautiful, the sun setting over the Mediterranean, turning the sea to gold and copper. The harbour would have been busy before sunset, ships being secured, cargo being unloaded or loaded, sailors heading to taverns, merchants concluding the day's business. The palace, on its hill overlooking the city, would have presented a commanding view from its walls. One could see the sea to the west, the mountains to the east, the coastal plain stretching north and south. Inside the palace, in the cool stone rooms away from the sun's heat, archives were kept. The tablets found here have given us extraordinary insight into Late Bronze Age life. There are administrative records tracking the palace economy. There are diplomatic letters, correspondence with the Hittite overlords who claimed Ugarit as a vassal, with Egypt to the south, with other coastal cities. There are legal documents, recording contracts, and disputes. There are literary texts, religious myths, and legends, giving us the stories that people told about gods and heroes. These texts reveal a society concerned with many of the same things that concern humans everywhere. There were disputes over property boundaries. There were marriage contracts specifying dowries and inheritance rights. There were cases of theft and assault brought before the king's court. There were rituals to be performed at proper times, offerings to gods who needed to be kept satisfied. The details are different from our own, but the fundamental human concerns are recognizable. The craftsmen of Ugarit produced beautiful work, gold jewelry, finely wrought, showing influences from Egypt and the Aegean. Carved ivory plaques depicting mythological scenes, used to decorate furniture. Bronze weapons with elaborate hilts. Seals carved in precious stones, each one unique, used to mark property and authenticate documents. These objects, found in the ruins, demonstrate a sophisticated artistic tradition, craftsmen at the height of their skills, working with excellent materials. But all of this, the trade networks and palace archives, the skilled craftsmen and wealthy merchants, the ships in the harbour, and the letters to foreign courts, all of this depended on stability. The system worked when ships could sail safely, when roads were open, when kingdoms maintained order in their territories. The prosperity of the late Bronze Age was built on this foundation of predictable security. When that security failed, when the predictability broke down, the complex system could not easily adapt. The vulnerability was there, hidden in the success. The same interconnection that created prosperity created dependency. When one part of the network failed, the failure could cascade. If tin supplies were disrupted, bronze production would suffer. If bronze production suffered, tool quality would decline. If tool quality declined, agricultural productivity would fall. If agricultural productivity fell, there would be less surplus to support cities. If cities could not be supported, the palace system would weaken. If the palace system weakened, it would be harder to maintain order and security. If order and security declined, trade would become more dangerous and difficult. And if trade declined, tin supplies would be disrupted. None of this was obvious in the moment. The system had worked for centuries. It had weathered problems before. There was no reason to think it could not weather new problems. The officials who managed the palace storerooms, the merchants who financed trading voyages, the farmers who planted their fields, all of them worked within a system they assumed was permanent, or at least durable enough that it would outlast their own lives. And so the work continued. Bronze was cast and worked, ships sailed, crops were planted and harvested. Scribes recorded it all, the steady accumulation of tablets, a written record of ordinary transactions, the stuff of daily life. The clay was pressed with wedge-shaped marks, allowed to dry, filed in the archive. The information would be there if anyone needed it. The accounts balanced, the obligations noted, everything in order. The bronze itself, copper and tin mixed in correct proportions, heated until it flowed like water, poured into molds or hammered into shape, would survive longer than the civilization that made it. Bronze objects could lie in the ground for 3,000 years and still be recognizable. The metal might develop a green patina, but the form would remain. A sword excavated from a Bronze Age tomb still looks like a sword. An ingot hauled up from a shipwreck still bears its maker's mark. The material culture persists, while the society that created it fades into archaeological interpretation and historical reconstruction. But on a quiet evening in the late Bronze Age, there was no reason to think about persistence or collapse. There was work to finish before dark. There were evening meals to prepare. There were children to put to bed. There was, for most people, the comfortable routine of daily life, the small concerns and satisfactions that make up human existence. The great events of history, the rise and fall of empires, happened around and through these ordinary lives, affecting them, disrupting them, sometimes destroying them, but never quite erasing the fundamental human experience of simply being alive. The world of bronze was also a world of people. It is easy, looking at archaeological remains and ancient texts, to see only systems and structures, trade routes and power relationships. But every transaction recorded on a tablet involved specific individuals. Every ship that sailed was crewed by men who knew each other's names. Every workshop employed people who laughed and argued, who had families and friends, who experienced joy and sorrow in their own lives. When we say that the Bronze Age collapsed, we are describing an economic and political transformation. But we are also describing human suffering on a massive scale. Cities burned. People died. Families were torn apart. Ways of life that had persisted for generations ended in violence and chaos. In the sections that follow, we will trace how this happened, but we should remember, as we do, that we are not just describing the fall of palaces and the disruption of trade. We are describing the end of a world for millions of people who lived in it. The Mycenaean Greeks built their palaces on high places, on hilltops with commanding views of the surrounding countryside. From these heights, they could see anyone approaching in troubled times. They could retreat behind massive walls, waiting out danger. The fortifications they built are still impressive today. Huge blocks of stone fitted together with such skill that later Greeks believed they must have been built by giants, the legendary Cyclopes with their single eyes. We still call them Cyclopean walls. Mycenae itself, the citadel that gave its name to this civilization, sits on a rocky hill in the Argolid, the plain of Argos in the northeastern Peloponnese. The site was occupied from the Neolithic period, but it became truly important in the late Bronze Age, around 1600 BCE. This is when the famous shaft graves were dug, deep pits cut into the rock, lined with stone, where the elite of Mycenae were buried with astonishing wealth. The grave goods from these shaft graves, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s, reveal a society with access to remarkable resources and skilled craftsmen. There were golden masks, thin sheets of gold hammered and shaped to cover the faces of the dead. There were golden cups and jewelry, bronze weapons inlaid with gold and silver, showing elaborate scenes of hunting. There were rings carved with intricate designs, ostrich eggs, and amber beads from distant lands. The quantity of gold was extraordinary, suggesting either great wealth or a period when gold was particularly abundant. These graves tell us that by 1600 BCE, Mycenaean elite society was already sophisticated and wealthy. Whether this wealth came from trade, from piracy, from conquest, or from some combination of all three, we cannot be certain. What is clear is that the rulers of Mycenae commanded resources and labor sufficient to construct elaborate tombs and fill them with precious goods. The dead of Mycenae's ruling class went to the afterlife, equipped for continued power and status. The palaces that was built in later centuries, the structures whose ruins we can still visit, date to the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. The Lion Gate, the famous entrance to Mycenae's citadel, with its 2 stone lions flanking a column, was built around 1250 BCE. By this time, Mycenae was one of several powerful centers in Greece, each ruling its own territory, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. Other major Mycenaean sites included Pylos in Messenia, on the southwest coast of the Peloponnese. The palace at Pylos was never fortified with massive walls like Mycenae, suggesting either more peaceful circumstances or perhaps more confidence. The palace was elaborately decorated with frescoes showing griffins and lions, processions and ceremonies. It had a large megaron, the central hall where the king held court, with a circular hearth in the center and 4 columns supporting the roof. Around the megaron were arranged storerooms, workshops, administrative offices, quarters for the royal household. Tiryns, not far from Mycenae, had walls even more massive than its larger neighbor, in some places over 20 feet thick. These walls enclosed the palace compound on the summit of the hill, with galleries inside the thickness of the walls themselves, mysterious corbel vaulted spaces that may have served for storage or, in times of siege, shelter. Walking through these galleries today, one can feel the weight of the stone above, can imagine guards on patrol, the echo of footsteps in the dark. Athens, too, had a Mycenaean palace, though less is known about it because the Acropolis has been built over repeatedly in later periods. But walls from the Bronze Age still exist, and myths remembered Athens as one of the significant powers of the era. Thebes in Boeotia was another major center, mentioned in the Linear B tablets, though its Bronze Age remains are difficult to access because the modern city sits atop the ancient one. The Mycenaean world extended beyond the Greek mainland. Crete, which had been the center of the earlier Minoan civilization, came under Mycenaean control in the 15th century BCE. The palace at Knossos, originally built by the Minoans, was taken over by Mycenaean rulers who adapted it for their own use. Linear B tablets, the Greek administrative writing system, appear at Knossos, showing that Greek speakers were now in charge. The change from Minoan to Mycenaean control marks a significant shift in the balance of power in the Aegean. Mycenaean colonies or outposts existed on many of the Aegean islands, on Rhodes and Kos, on several of the Cycladic islands. Mycenaean pottery appears throughout the eastern Mediterranean, found in Egypt, Cyprus, the Levantine coast, even in southern Italy. Whether this pottery represents actual Mycenaean settlers or simply trade goods carried by merchants, local or foreign, is debated. What is clear is that Mycenaean culture was widespread and influential during the late Bronze Age. The language spoken by the Mycenaeans was an early form of Greek, recorded in the Linear B script. This script was deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris, a brilliant achievement that opened up Mycenaean texts to modern understanding. The decipherment revealed that Linear B recorded Greek, not some unknown language, meaning that the Mycenaeans were ancestors of the classical Greeks, speakers of a language that would eventually produce Homer and the tragedies, philosophy, and history. But the Linear B texts themselves are not literature. They are administrative records, inventories and accounts, lists of offerings to gods, and distributions to workers. They tell us about the palace economy in exhaustive detail. We know from these tablets how many rowers were sent to a certain location. We know which villages owed how many pigs. We know the names of gods who received offerings and the gods who did not. We know textile production was organized with women workers divided into groups, each group with a supervisor, their output carefully tracked. The religion recorded in the Linear B tablets is recognizably ancestral to classical Greek religion. Zeus and Hera appear. Poseidon is prominent, possibly more important in Mycenaean times than later Athena. Artemis, Dionysus, all are named. But there are also gods whose names did not survive into the classical period, or whose relationships to other gods seem different. The religion was evolving, and what we see in the Linear B tablets is a snapshot of that evolution. The Mycenaean palaces were not just administrative centers. They were also religious centers, places where important rituals were performed. At Pylos, there were numerous shrines within the palace complex, small rooms where offerings were made, where cult objects were kept. The Megaron itself may have had religious functions, the king perhaps serving as chief priest in some ceremonies. The hearth in the center of the Megaron was sacred. Fire kept burning, offerings poured into it. Outside the palaces, there were other religious sites, the peak sanctuaries, mountaintop shrines where offerings were made, continued a tradition that went back to Minoan Crete cave sanctuaries, dark places deep underground, where altars were built and votives left, connected the Mycenaeans to the earth and the powers below. These sites were sometimes locations of pilgrimage, places where people from different communities might gather for festivals or ceremonies. The Mycenaean economy was palace-centered, but not exclusively so. Farmers worked land that was organized in complex patterns of ownership and obligation. Some land belonged directly to the palace. Some land belonged to gods, worked by the temple's dependents. Some land was held by individuals who nonetheless owed obligations to the palace, taxes paid in produce or labor. Linear B tablets record all of this, a window into the economic organization of a Bronze Age state. The military capacity of the Mycenaean palaces is attested both by the massive fortifications and by the weapons found in tombs and hoards. The Mycenaeans were warriors. Their elite were buried with swords and spears, with boars' tusk helmets and bronze armor. The Linear B tablets record chariots and horses, weapons being repaired or distributed. The palace at Pylos, in its final days, was organizing coastal defenses, suggesting military preparedness. The famous Homeric epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, were composed centuries after the Bronze Age ended in the 8th century BCE. But they preserve memories, however transformed by time and oral tradition, of the Mycenaean age. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad, listing the Greek forces that sailed to Troy, includes many Mycenaean sites. The palaces that Homer describes, though he gets details wrong from a Bronze Age perspective, reflect a memory of palace culture. The warrior elite, the kings and heroes, the code of honor and gift exchange, all of this has roots in the Mycenaean world. Whether the Trojan War itself was a historical event remains debated. There was a city at Troy, and it shows signs of destruction around 1200 BCE, consistent with the traditional dating. But whether it was destroyed by Mycenaean Greeks, and whether that destruction was anything like the 10-year siege Homer describes, we cannot know. What we can say is that the Mycenaeans were capable of mounting overseas expeditions, that they had the ships and the military organization to project power beyond the Greek mainland. The Mycenaean ships depicted in art show vessels with oars and a single square sail. These were not the triremes of classical Greece, but earlier, simpler designs. Still, they were seaworthy enough to cross the Aegean, to reach Crete, to trade with Cyprus and the Levantine coast. The crews of these ships were skilled enough to navigate by stars and landmarks, to judge weather, to find their way across open water when necessary. The question of Mycenaean political organization remains somewhat mysterious. Were the various palaces independent kingdoms, or was there some kind of overarching authority? Homer suggests Mycenae held a kind of high kingship, Agamemnon ruling as first among equals. The archaeological evidence does not clearly confirm or deny this. What seems likely is that the political structure was somewhere between complete independence and unified empire, perhaps a confederation or alliance system where stronger powers had influence over weaker ones. The relationship with the Hittite Empire is particularly interesting. In Hittite texts, there are references to a kingdom called Ahiawa, and many scholars believe this refers to the Mycenaean Greeks, possibly from the word Achaean, Homer's term for the Greeks. If this identification is correct, the Hittites and Mycenaeans were in diplomatic contact, sometimes allies, sometimes competitors, particularly in western Anatolia, where their spheres of influence overlapped. One Hittite letter mentions a king of Ahiawa as a great king, a term of respect used only for the most powerful rulers. This suggests that the Mycenaean world, or at least part of it, was considered by the Hittites as a major power, worthy of diplomatic negotiation rather than conquest or dismissal. The exact relationship remains unclear because we lack the Mycenaean side of the correspondence, but the Hittite evidence suggests regular interaction. The Mycenaean period lasted from approximately 1600 to 1100 BCE, 500 years of continuous development. This is as long a period as from the discovery of America to the present day. During this time, styles changed, power shifted, new palaces were built, and old ones modified. The Mycenaeans who lived in 1600 BCE would have found the world of 1200 BCE somewhat different, though still recognizably their own. The continuity was strong, the cultural traditions maintained, the language still Greek, the gods still the same gods. The art and craftsmanship of the Mycenaeans was beautiful. The frescoes that decorated palace walls showed processions of figures, women in elaborate dresses, men in kilts and tunics. The colors were vivid, the ochres and blues still bright when first excavated, though they fade quickly when exposed to light and air. The scenes depicted were often ceremonial, showing religious activities or scenes from nature, griffins and dolphins, flowers and spirals. Pottery from this period shows development over time. Early Mycenaean pottery was influenced by Minoan styles, but gradually became more distinctively Mycenaean. The shapes included large storage jars and smaller vessels for serving, cups and bowls, stirrup jars with their distinctive spout and handles. The decoration moved from naturalistic to more stylized geometric patterns, becoming more common in later periods. This stylization would eventually lead into the geometric style of early Iron Age Greece. The tombs of the Mycenaean elite developed from the shaft graves to the tholos tombs, magnificent beehive-shaped structures built with corbelled vaults, each course of stone projecting slightly beyond the one below until meeting at the top, the treasury of Atreus at Mycenae. The largest and finest of these tholos tombs has an entrance passage lined with massive blocks, a doorway over 30 feet high, and an interior chamber that still impresses visitors with its height and the precision of its construction. These tholos tombs were used for multiple burials over time. The older remains sometimes moved aside to make room for new interments. They were family tombs, or perhaps tombs for specific lineages within the ruling class. The labor required to build them was substantial, another indication of the power that Mycenaean rulers could command. A tomb like the treasury of Atreus took months to build, required skilled stonemasons, and demonstrated permanent commitment to honoring the dead. Daily life in a Mycenaean palace compound would have been busy and complex. In the workshops, craftsmen worked at their specialties. The bronze smiths heated their metal in furnaces, the glow of molten bronze lighting their faces. The potters turned their wheels, shaping clay into familiar forms. The textile workers, mostly women according to the tablets, worked at looms, creating cloth from wool and flax. The scribes in their offices pressed marks into clay, recording the day's transactions. In the storerooms, the great pithoi stood in rows, their contents marked with painted signs, or perhaps labels that have not survived. The smell of stored grain and oil, the coolness of the stone-walled rooms, the dim light from small windows or oil lamps. A steward checking inventory, counting jars, making sure the accounts matched reality. The steady accumulation of supplies against winter or siege, the surplus that made palace life possible. In the kitchens, preparation for the evening meal. Bread baking in ovens, the yeasty smell filling the air. Meat roasting, probably sheep or goat more commonly than beef. Cattle being more valuable for labor and dairy. Wine mixed with water in large craters, the standard drink. Olive oil in everything. The foundation of Mediterranean diet then as now. Servants moving between rooms, carrying vessels, attending to the needs of the royal household. And in the Megaron, as evening came on, perhaps the king sat with his advisers, discussing matters of state. The hearth in the center of the room glowing with fire, the columns rising to support the roof, the painted walls showing scenes of power and majesty. The king in his high seat, listening to reports, making decisions, maintaining the relationships that held the kingdom together. This was personal rule, government by face-to-face relationships, by the king's direct knowledge of his officials and their knowledge of him. The Mycenaean world in 1250 BCE was at or near its height. The palaces were elaborate and well-maintained. The fortification walls had been recently expanded or strengthened. The tomb monuments showed wealth and power. The linear B tablets demonstrate sophisticated administration. Trade connections extended across the Mediterranean. Everything suggested continued prosperity, continued power. But maintenance of massive fortifications is telling. Walls like those at Mycenae and Tiryns required enormous labor to build. They were not decorative. They were serious military architecture, designed to withstand siege, to provide protection against serious military threat. The decision to invest in such defenses suggests concern about security, awareness of danger, even if the specific nature of that danger was not yet clear. The coastal defenses being organized at Pylos in the final tablets suggest similar concern. Something was threatening the coasts. Something required watchers to be posted, rowers to be mobilized. The palace was taking precautions. Whether these precautions were adequate, whether they addressed the actual danger, we will see. What we know is that the concern was there, recorded in clay, a warning that went unheeded or proved insufficient. The evening in a Mycenaean palace in those final peaceful years would have ended as evenings had ended for generations. The fire in the Megaron dying down to coals, the king retiring to his quarters, the guards taking up their positions for the night watch. The palace settling into darkness, the quiet broken only by the occasional sound of a night bird or a dog barking somewhere in the lower town. The stones of the walls still held the warmth of the day. The frescoes on the walls were still bright. The bronze weapons in the armory were sharp and well maintained. The scribes' tablets were filed in order. The grain in the storerooms would feed the palace for months. Everything was in its proper place, maintained by centuries of tradition, organized by experienced administrators, protected by strong walls and well-armed warriors. And yet, within a few decades, it would all be gone. The palaces would burn, the administrative system would collapse, the linear B script would be forgotten, not to be read again for 3,000 years. The Mycenaean world would end, not gradually, not through slow decline, but catastrophically, in a wave of destruction that left the ruins we can still visit today. How that happened, why it happened, is the story we must now pursue. Far to the east of Mycenaean Greece, across the Aegean Sea, and beyond the coastal plains of western Anatolia, rising into the central plateau, stood the kingdom of the Hittites. Their capital, Hattusa, lay in a landscape of hills and rocky outcrops, high enough that winters brought snow. Summer nights cooled pleasantly, even when days were hot. The site was naturally defensible, surrounded by cliffs and steep slopes, accessible only through carefully controlled gates. The Hittites called themselves Nasili, speakers of Nesa, after an important early city. The name Hittite comes from the Bible, where they are mentioned as one of the peoples of Canaan. The connection is valid but complex, since the Hittite Empire had fallen centuries before the biblical accounts were written, and what the Bible calls Hittites may be remnants or successors of the great imperial power. We use the name because it is traditional. But we should remember it was not what they called themselves. The Hittite language, written in cuneiform, borrowed and adapted from Mesopotamian tradition, was Indo-European, related distantly to Greek and Sanskrit, to Celtic and Germanic. The Hittites were probably not original inhabitants of Anatolia, but had arrived sometime in the 3rd millennium BCE, becoming one of several peoples sharing the region. By the early 2nd millennium, they had established a kingdom, and by 1600 BCE, an empire. The Old Kingdom period of Hittite history saw expansion and consolidation. Kings led armies south into Syria, sometimes reaching Babylon itself, though they could not hold such distant conquests. The real strength of the Hittites lay in Anatolia, in control of the plateau and the routes that crossed it, in alliance with or domination of the many small kingdoms and city-states that dotted the region. The Hittite king claimed to be Great King, King of Hatti, beloved of the storm god, titles that asserted both political power and divine favor. After a period of internal strife, the Hittite Empire reached its height during what scholars call the New Kingdom period, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE. This was the era of the greatest territorial extent, when Hittite power reached from western Anatolia to the upper Euphrates, when Syria was divided into a Hittite sphere in the north and an Egyptian sphere in the south, when the two powers engaged in both warfare and diplomacy, eventually agreeing to one of the earliest known peace treaties. Hattusa during this period was a city of perhaps 40 to 50,000 people, though estimates vary. The citadel on the highest point held the royal palace, and the main temples, the lower city, spread across the slopes and valleys, defended by walls that ran for miles. The fortifications were impressive, stone foundations supporting mud brick walls, towers at intervals, gates decorated with carved reliefs. The Lion Gate showed 2 lions in relief flanking the entrance. The King's Gate had a relief of a god or king in warrior gear. The Sphinx Gate, discovered by archaeologists, had worn sphinxes that originally guarded the way. Inside the city walls, temples dominated the architecture. The Great Temple, excavated and partly reconstructed, covered a huge area. It was surrounded by storage magazines, dozens of rooms filled with pithoi, much like those in Mycenaean palaces. The temple controlled enormous resources, supported a large staff of priests and servants, received offerings from the king and wealthy individuals. This was not just a place of worship, but an economic institution, a landowner and producer, an employer and redistributor. The Hittite religion was complex, incorporating gods from multiple traditions. The Hittites had their own native gods, including the storm god who headed the pantheon and the sun goddess of Arina. But they also adopted gods from Ahurians, a people who lived to their southeast, and from other subject peoples. The Hittite attitude was inclusive, that more gods meant more divine protection, that a conquered city's gods should be brought to Hattusa and honored there, incorporated into the imperial cult. This religious tolerance was connected to political pragmatism. The Hittite Empire was not ethnically homogeneous. It ruled over many different peoples, each with their own language and traditions. The Hittites maintained control through a combination of military force, political alliances sealed by marriage, and respect for local custom. A subject king might continue to rule his city under Hittite overlordship, owing tribute and military support, but maintaining internal autonomy. The archives at Hattusa, discovered by German archaeologists starting in the early 20th century, have yielded thousands of clay tablets. These are written in several languages, primarily Hittite itself, but also Akkadian, the international diplomatic language, and other local languages. The tablets include historical annals, religious texts, diplomatic correspondence, treaties, legal documents, and administrative records. They give us an unusually full picture of Hittite government and society. The Hittite kings were powerful, but not absolute. They had to consult with a council of nobles, the Pancus, at least in early periods. By the New Kingdom, royal power had increased, but great families still held significant influence. The king's position was hereditary, but could be contested, and succession crises were not uncommon. The documents include elaborate instructions for palace officials, detailing their duties and the proper protocol for royal audiences. The most famous Hittite king of the New Kingdom period was probably Muwatalli II, who fought the Egyptians at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles recorded from ancient times. His successor, Hattusili III, made peace with Egypt and married a daughter to Pharaoh Rameses II, creating an alliance that would last for decades. The correspondence between Hattusili and Rameses, preserved in both Hittite and Egyptian archives, shows the two rulers as equals, each addressing the other as brother, negotiating over details of the marriage and the maintenance of peaceful relations. Hittite military power rested partly on their mastery of chariot warfare. The Hittite chariot, heavier than the Egyptian version, carried a crew of 3, a driver, a warrior with spear, and a shield-bearer. These chariots, drawn by 2 horses, could charge in formation, breaking infantry lines, pursuing broken enemies. The Hittites also used infantry, both their own troops and contingents, supplied by vassal kingdoms. The army was organized and supplied by the palace, maintained by the agricultural surplus of the empire's territories. The economy of the Hittite Empire was agricultural at its base, as all Bronze Age economies were. The plateau of central Anatolia is not easy farming country, the soil thin in many places, rainfall uncertain. But valleys and lower slopes could be cultivated, producing grain and legumes, supporting orchards of fruit and nut trees. Herding of sheep and goats utilized marginal land. The combination provided subsistence for a large population. But the real wealth of the Hittite Empire came from control of resources and trade routes. Anatolia had deposits of copper, silver, lead, and iron. The Hittites controlled access to these minerals, could tax their export, could restrict their availability to potential enemies. Anatolia was also a crossroads, caravans traveling between Mesopotamia and the Aegean, between the Black Sea and Syria, passed through Hittite territory. Taxing this trade provided revenue. The Hittites had mastered the working of iron, though it was not yet common enough to replace bronze for most purposes. Iron was valuable, used for special objects, sometimes given as diplomatic gifts. One letter from a Hittite king apologizes for not being able to send iron as requested, because the weather was not right for production, suggesting some specialized process, perhaps steelmaking, that required specific conditions. This early knowledge of iron working would become increasingly important as iron gradually replaced bronze in the early Iron Age. The relationship between the Hittites and their western Anatolian neighbors was complex and often contentious. The city of Wilusa, probably the Troy of Greek legend, was sometimes a Hittite ally, sometimes independent, sometimes a source of conflict with the Mycenaean Greeks. The Arzawa lands in western Anatolia sometimes acknowledged Hittite overlordship, sometimes rebelled. The Hittite kings led repeated campaigns into the west, trying to maintain control, to secure frontiers, to prevent rival powers from establishing themselves too close to the Hittite heartland. In the east, the Hittite frontier faced Assyria, an expanding power based in northern Mesopotamia. The relationship between the Hittites and Assyrians was competitive. Both claimed overlordship of the same Syrian territories. Both wanted control of the trade routes. The boundary between their spheres of influence shifted with the fortunes of war. Treaties establishing borders that might or might not be respected depending on the relative strength of each power at any given time. In the south, the Hittite frontier in Syria brought them into contact with Egypt. The conflict over control of Syrian cities and territories led to the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE. Both sides claimed victory. Rameses II had the battle depicted on temple walls in Egypt, showing himself heroically fighting surrounded by enemies. The Hittite account is less detailed, but suggests the battle was indecisive. What is clear is that neither side achieved decisive victory, and the conflict eventually led both to conclude that peace was preferable to continued warfare. The peace treaty between Hattusili III and Rameses II, concluded around 1259 BCE, is preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. The two versions are remarkably similar, showing that both sides understood the agreement in the same way. The treaty established a mutual defense pact, extradition of fugitives, and peace between the two powers. It held for the remaining decades of the Hittite Empire, a rare example of a stable peace between major powers in the ancient world. The daily life in Hattusa would have centered on the palace and temples, but the lower city held residential areas, workshops, markets. Houses were built of stone foundations with mud brick walls, flat roofs that could be used as additional living space in good weather streets, followed the natural terrain, winding around rock outcrops, climbing the slopes in steps. Water was supplied by springs and by elaborate systems to catch and store rainwater, essential in a city on a hilltop, far from any large river. The climate of central Anatolia meant that winter was a quiet season. Armies did not campaign when snow might block the passes. Trade caravans waited for better weather. In the palace, the scribes might work on composing new versions of historical annals, recording the previous year's events, copying out older texts to preserve them. In the temples, winter festivals honored gods, rituals performed to ensure the return of spring, the renewal of life. Spring brought renewal of activity. Farmers planted their fields. The king might lead her army on campaign, or send generals to trouble spots, or receive ambassadors from vassal states coming to renew their oaths of loyalty. Merchants prepared for the trading season, organizing caravans, gathering goods for export, arranging credit and partnerships. The city awakened from winter's quiet. Summer was campaign season for the army. The king or his generals would march with troops, traveling to disputed territories, besieging rebellious cities, meeting enemy armies in battle. These campaigns might last months, the army living off the land, supplied by requisitions from the territories they passed through. The goal was to establish control, to extract tribute, to demonstrate power sufficient that rebellion would seem futile. Autumn brought the harvest, the critical season when the year's agricultural work came to fruition. The success or failure of the harvest determined prosperity or hardship for the coming year. Palace officials supervised the collection of taxes, stored grain and other produce, calculated what was available for palace use. Festivals thanked the gods for the harvest, offering first fruits, praying for continued favor. The Hittite texts include many religious rituals, detailed instructions for festivals and ceremonies. Some of these festivals lasted for days, involving processions between temples, offerings at multiple locations, specific prayers and hymns to be recited. The king played a central role in major festivals, officiating as chief priest, mediating between the gods and the people. This religious role was as important as military or political leadership, maintaining the cosmic order, ensuring divine favor for the kingdom. But the texts also record problems and fears. There are rituals to counter plague, suggesting that disease was a recurring threat. There are prayers asking gods why they are angry, what has been done wrong, how their favor can be regained. There are omens, interpreted by priests, trying to read divine will from the flight of birds, the shape of liver from sacrificed animals, the behavior of fire. The Hittites, like all Bronze Age peoples, lived in a world where the favor of gods was understood to be essential, where disaster might strike if rituals were neglected or performed incorrectly. In the late 13th century BCE, the century before 1200, the Hittite Empire seemed secure. The peace with Egypt held. The western frontiers were stable. Assyria was facing its own problems and was not currently pressing on the eastern frontier. The archives show regular administration, tribute flowing in from subject territories, diplomatic correspondence with neighboring powers. If there were stresses, they were being managed within normal parameters. But there were signs of trouble. Letters from vassal states sometimes mentioned raids, groups of attackers whose origins were unclear. There were requests for military assistance, for grain during shortages. There were reports of population movements, people displaced by drought or conflict in one area, putting pressure on another area. Individually, none of these seemed to constitute a crisis, but together they suggested a world under increasing stress. The Hittite Empire's strength was its organization, its ability to coordinate resources across a large territory, to move troops where needed, to provide grain from areas of surplus to areas of shortage. But this strength required that the system continue to function, that roads remain open, that messengers can travel safely, that subject kings remain loyal. If the system began to break down, if problems cascaded faster than they could be addressed, the empire's size and complexity could become a vulnerability rather than a strength. In the palace at Hattusa, as evening came, The king perhaps reviewed reports from his governors, letters from vassal kings, intelligence from scouts and merchants, oil lamps flickered, casting shadows on cuneiform tablets. Scribes waited to record the king's responses, the orders to be sent out. The business of empire continued, day after day, season after season, as it had for centuries, as it was assumed it would continue for centuries to come. The storm god watched over Hattusa from his sanctuary in the great temple, his image standing in the inner chamber, clothed and fed by priests, honored with offerings, the sun. Goddess of Arina, chief goddess of the empire, received her worship. The 1,000 gods of Hatti, the phrase the Hittites used for their vast pantheon, were all in their places, maintaining the cosmic order, protecting the land and the people. And on a particular evening, probably in early autumn when the harvest was complete, perhaps around 1205 or 1200 BCE, the sun set once more over the walls of Hattusa. The guards on the towers looked outward, toward the horizons, watching for dangers that had not yet appeared. Inside the city, people went about their evening routines, preparing food, settling children for sleep, tending to the last tasks of the day. The stones of the great walls stood firm, as they had stood for 2 centuries, as everyone assumed they would stand for centuries more. But the world was changing in ways that the watchers on the walls could not yet see. Forces were in motion that would break the system, that would overwhelm the empire's defenses, that would bring down the palaces and silence the temples. The quiet of that particular evening would not last much longer. Along the banks of the Nile, life followed rhythms as old as the river itself. Each year the flood came, the water rising through summer until the river overflowed its banks, spreading across the floodplain, depositing fresh silt that renewed the soil. As the water receded, farmers planted in the dark earth, seeds growing in the warmth. Harvest came in spring, grain cut and gathered before the heat of summer. Then the flood would come again, the cycle repeating as it had repeated for thousands of years. Egypt in the late Bronze Age was ancient in a way that the Mycenaean and Hittite kingdoms were not. Egyptian civilization had existed for over 2,000 years already. The pyramids at Giza, already ancient monuments, had been standing for more than 1,000 years when our story begins. The memory of Old Kingdom pharaohs, of Middle Kingdom reunification, of the Hyksos occupation and its ending, all of this was part of Egyptian historical consciousness in a way that had no parallel elsewhere in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The late Bronze Age in Egypt is called the New Kingdom, the period following the expulsion of the Hyksos, the foreign rulers who had controlled Lower Egypt during what is called the Second Intermediate Period. The New Kingdom pharaohs, starting with Ahmose, around 1550 BCE, reunified Egypt and then expanded its power into Syria and Nubia, creating an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the cataracts of the Nile, from the Mediterranean coast to deep into what is now Sudan. This imperial expansion brought Egypt into contact with the other great powers of the late Bronze Age. The pharaohs corresponded with Hittite kings and Babylonian kings, with the rulers of Mitanni and Assyria, with the kings of Cyprus and the city-states of the Levantine coast. This correspondence, found in the archives at Amarna, The short-lived capital, built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, gives us insight into international diplomacy. The way rulers negotiated marriages and alliances, requested gold and horses, complained about inadequate gifts or delays in sending agreed-upon shipments. The wealth of Egypt came from the Nile. The annual flood made Egyptian agriculture incredibly productive. The valley was a ribbon of green through the desert, narrow in Upper Egypt, where the river was confined between cliffs, wider in the delta, where the river split into many channels. The black soil, Kemet in Egyptian, was so productive that Egypt could support a large population and still produce substantial surplus. This surplus funded the temples and palaces, the army and the bureaucracy, the building projects and the royal tombs. The pharaohs of the late Bronze Age were buried in the Valley of the Kings, a dry wadi near Thebes, where tombs were cut into the rock, decorated with elaborate paintings, filled with treasures for the afterlife. Most of these tombs were robbed in antiquity, their contents dispersed. But one tomb escaped, that of Tutankhamun, a relatively minor pharaoh who died young. The treasures found in his tomb when it was excavated in the 1920s give us some sense of what the tombs of more important pharaohs must have contained. The great pharaohs of the New Kingdom include Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled as pharaoh, depicted in art with the false beard and regalia of kingship. She sponsored trading expeditions to Punt, probably located in the Horn of Africa, bringing back myrrh trees and other exotic goods. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs near the Valley of the Kings, is one of the most beautiful buildings of ancient Egypt, its colonnades rising in terraces against the rock face. Thutmose III, stepson and successor of Hatshepsut, was perhaps the greatest military pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He led at least 17 campaigns into Syria and Palestine, extending Egyptian control northward, defeating the king of Mitanni, reaching the Euphrates. His annals, recorded on temple walls at Karnak, list the cities he captured, the tribute he extracted, the enemies he defeated. He presented himself as the ideal warrior king, invincible in battle, favored by the gods. Amenhotep III, who ruled in the mid-14th century BCE, presided over Egypt at the height of its power and prosperity. His reign was largely peaceful, allowing him to focus on building. The Temple of Luxor was largely his work. He built a mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, of which only the colossal statues called the Colossi of Memnon still stand. He corresponded with foreign rulers as an equal or superior, his requests for trade goods phrased as commands, foreign kings eager to please him to maintain good relations. His son, Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, is one of the most controversial figures in Egyptian history. He attempted a religious revolution, promoting the worship of the Aten, the sun disk, above all other gods, moving the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, trying to break the power of the priests of Amun. The experiment lasted his reign, but was reversed after his death. His successors tried to erase his memory, destroying his monuments, scratching his name from king lists. Only the dry desert sand of Amarna preserved some of his city and its archives. After Akhenaten came several short-lived pharaohs, including Tutankhamun, and then Horemheb, a general who restored traditional religion and began the process of dismantling Akhenaten's legacy. Horemheb was succeeded by another general, Ramesses I, founder of the 19th dynasty. His son, Seti I, and especially his grandson, Ramesses II, brought Egypt to a new peak of power. Ramesses II ruled for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. He is often considered Egypt's greatest pharaoh, certainly its most prolific builder. His monuments are everywhere in Egypt: temples at Abu Simbel and Karnak and Luxor, the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, statues and obelisks, his name carved on buildings erected by earlier pharaohs. He fought the Hittites at Kadesh, and later made peace with them, marrying a Hittite princess to cement the alliance. The city of Pi-Ramesses, built by Ramesses II in the eastern delta, was his capital, a vast complex of palaces and temples, administrative buildings and military installations. The city controlled the eastern frontier, the gateway to Asia, the staging point for campaigns into Palestine and Syria. Its harbour facilities accommodated the ships that traded with the Levantine coast and beyond. The city was built on a scale intended to impress, to demonstrate the power and wealth of the pharaoh. Egyptian society was highly stratified. At the top, the pharaoh, who was not just a king, but a god incarnate, the living Horus, the son of Ra below the pharaoh, the royal family and the high nobility, people who held major offices, controlled large estates, lived in luxury. Below them, the priests and officials, the scribes and administrators, people of education and responsibility. Then the artisans and merchants, skilled workers who produced goods and facilitated trade. At the base, the farmers who worked the land, the majority of the population, whose labor fed everyone else. This hierarchy was understood to be divinely ordained. The gods had created the world with proper order, ma'at, a concept that encompassed truth, justice, harmony, and proper social order. Everyone had their place in this order, and keeping to one's place, fulfilling one's role properly, maintained ma'at. The pharaoh's primary responsibility was to maintain ma'at, to keep Egypt in harmony with the divine order, to perform rituals correctly, to dispense justice, to defend the land against chaos represented by foreign enemies and internal disorder. The religion of Egypt was complex and ancient, its gods numerous, their relationships sometimes contradictory depending on which tradition one followed. Ra, the sun god, travelled across the sky each day in his boat, descended into the underworld each night to battle the serpent Apophis, emerging victorious each dawn. Osiris, god of the dead and of rebirth, was killed by his brother Set, then resurrected by his wife Isis, becoming king of the underworld. Horus, son of Osiris and Isis, avenged his father and became the living pharaoh. These myths were not just stories but explanations of reality, models for understanding life and death, the daily cycle of the sun, the annual cycle of the Nile flood, the transfer of power from one pharaoh to the next. The rituals performed in temples were not merely symbolic, but actual maintenance of cosmic order, feeding the gods, clothing them, honoring them, ensuring their continued favor. The temples of Egypt were enormous institutions. The temple of Amun at Karnak continuously expanded over centuries, eventually became one of the largest religious structures in the world. It employed thousands of people, priests and servants, scribes and guards, craftsmen and laborers. It owned vast estates, received income from royal grants and private donations, controlled resources that made it a major economic power independent of the royal court. The temple rituals were elaborate and strictly regulated. Only certain priests, purified by ritual, could enter the inner sanctum where the god's statue stood each day. The statue was awakened, washed, dressed, fed, then sealed back into the sanctuary. On festival days, the god might be carried in procession, the statue in its shrine placed on a sacred boat, carried by priests through the temple and sometimes through the streets, allowing the people to see their god and ask for blessings. The relationship between the pharaoh and the priests of Amun was sometimes tense. The priesthood was powerful, wealthy, independent. The pharaoh needed their support to legitimize his rule, but they could potentially challenge him if they chose. Akhenaten's attempt to supplant Amun with the Aten can be understood partly as an attempt to break priestly power, to establish a religious system centered entirely on the pharaoh, without powerful intermediaries. The failure of this attempt showed the limits of even a pharaoh's power. The art of Egypt in the New Kingdom followed ancient conventions, but also showed new influences. Tomb paintings became more naturalistic in some ways, showing gardens and pools, birds and animals, scenes of hunting and fishing. The distinctive Egyptian artistic style, with figures shown in composite view, head in profile but eye frontal, shoulders frontal but legs in profile, remained standard. But within these conventions, artists created lively and beautiful scenes. The great rock-cut temples built by Ramesses II at Abu Simbel in far southern Egypt show the power and confidence of New Kingdom Egypt. 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh, each over 60 feet high, sit at the entrance, gazing east towards the Nile. Inside, the temple is carved deep into the cliff, its halls and chambers decorated with reliefs showing Ramesses in triumph, protecting Egypt, favored by the gods twice a year on specific dates. The rising sun illuminates the inner sanctuary, lighting up statues of the gods and the pharaoh. Trade brought Egypt into contact with the wider world. Egyptian gold was famous and desired. The pharaohs received requests from foreign rulers for gold, which they sometimes granted, sometimes refused. In return, Egypt imported cedar wood from Lebanon, needed for construction and shipbuilding. They imported copper and tin for bronze. They imported horses from the north, luxury goods from many regions, exotic animals, and plants for royal parks. Egyptian merchants traveled abroad, and foreign merchants came to Egypt. At Pi-Ramesses, in the cosmopolitan delta, many languages could be heard: Akkadian and Canaanite, perhaps Greek, perhaps the languages of Nubia and Libya. The port facilities handled ships from across the eastern Mediterranean, goods flowing in and out, the city a hub in the Bronze Age trade network. But Egypt also maintained a certain isolation. The desert on both sides of the Nile Valley provided natural protection. Most foreigners saw only the delta or the Nile Valley itself, not the deep interior, the Egyptian language, completely different from the Semitic languages of the Levant or the Indo-European languages of the north, reinforced this sense of separateness. Egypt was the Black Land, Kemet, the fertile valley. Beyond was the Red Land, Deshret, the desert, home of chaos and foreign enemies. This sense of Egypt as a distinct place, a gift of the Nile as the Greek historian Herodotus would later call it, was deeply embedded in Egyptian consciousness. Egypt had existed since the beginning of time, according to Egyptian belief. The gods had created Egypt first, and then the rest of the world. The pharaoh was the guarantor of cosmic order, not just a political leader, but a religious necessity. Without the pharaoh, Ma'at would fail. Chaos would return. The sun might not rise. This belief system provided remarkable stability. Even when foreign rulers controlled Egypt, as the Hyksos had, they adopted Egyptian royal ideology, presented themselves as pharaohs, maintained the traditional rituals. When Egyptian power waned, the ideology survived, ready to support renewed centralization. The continuity of Egyptian civilization across 3,000 years testifies to the strength of these cultural patterns. But continuity does not mean unchanging. Egyptian culture absorbed influences from its contacts with other peoples. New Kingdom art shows influences from the Levant and the Aegean. Egyptian military technology adopted innovations like the chariot, which came from the north. Egyptian religion incorporated foreign gods, identifying them with Egyptian deities or adding them to the pantheon. The culture was conservative but not static, maintaining core elements while adapting to new circumstances. The military power of New Kingdom Egypt was formidable. The army included professional soldiers, career officers, a corps of charioteers. In time of major campaigns, conscripts would be added, farmers and workers called up for service. The army was organized in divisions, each named for a god, commanded by generals appointed by the pharaoh. Egyptian soldiers fought with bronze weapons, spears and swords, composite bows that could shoot arrows with considerable force and accuracy. The chariot was central to Egyptian military tactics. Egyptian chariots were light and fast, drawn by 2 horses, carrying a crew of 2, a driver, and an archer. These chariots could move rapidly on battlefield, shooting arrows, pursuing broken enemies, providing mobile firepower that could disrupt enemy formations. The training and maintenance of chariot forces was expensive, requiring specialized craftsmen to build and repair the vehicles, trainers to prepare horses and crew. But the military advantage justified the cost. Egyptian fortresses guarded the frontiers and key routes. In Nubia, a string of massive mud brick fortresses controlled the Nile, ensuring Egyptian control of the gold mines and trade routes to the south. In the Sinai and southern Palestine, fortresses controlled the roads into Egypt, early warning posts against invasion, bases for Egyptian campaigns into Asia. These fortresses were sophisticated structures, with multiple walls, towers, gates designed to be easily defended against assault. The Nile itself was a highway. Travel by river much easier than travel by land. Egyptian ships built of local wood or imported cedar moved goods and people up and down the river. The current flowed north toward the delta, while the prevailing wind blew from the north, so ships could sail south with the wind or drift north with the current, making river travel efficient in both directions. Larger seagoing vessels, built with Egyptian timber or imported cedar, carried trade goods across the Mediterranean, reaching Byblos and other Levantine ports. The stability and prosperity of New Kingdom Egypt seemed secure. The system had survived for centuries. Even the crisis of Akhenaten's reign had been overcome, traditional order restored. The peace with the Hittites removed a major external threat. Nubian gold continued to flow. The harvest was generally adequate, sometimes abundant. The temples were maintained, the gods honored, the rituals performed correctly. As evening came to Pi-Ramesses on a date we can no longer specify, perhaps in the reign of Rameses II or his successors, the palace compound would have been magnificent in the last light. The glazed tiles would have caught the sun, blue and green and gold. The gardens would have been cool, irrigation channels bringing water to date palms and lotus pools. The walls, painted with scenes of triumph and prosperity, would have proclaimed the eternal power of Pharaoh. In the temples, priests prepared for evening rituals. Offerings were made, incense burned, hymns sung to the gods. The sacred barks stood in their sanctuaries, the gods dwelling within, protecting Egypt as they had always done. The priests, in their linen garments, ritually pure, moved through the rituals that had been performed for centuries, maintaining Ma'at, keeping cosmic order. In the barracks, soldiers drilled or rested, maintaining readiness. The chariot horses were groomed and fed, the vehicles checked for damage, the weapons oiled and sharp, the fortresses on the frontiers were manned, watchers posted. The system that protected Egypt functioned as it was designed to function, preparing for threats that were understood, ready to respond to challenges that fit within known patterns. In the fields, as the sun touched the horizon, farmers returned from their labor, another day's work complete. The irrigation channels would need attention, the crops would need watching as they grew. But for now, the day was ending, and there was rest, and the evening meal, family and community, the rhythms of life that continued, regardless of what happened in palaces and temples. Egypt in the late Bronze Age had the weight of centuries behind it, a confidence born of long survival, a belief in its own permanence. The monuments built by the pharaohs were intended to last forever, and many of them have. The culture was designed for continuity, every king linking himself to his predecessors, asserting his place in an eternal succession. When troubles came, as they inevitably did, Egypt had always found a way to persist, to restore Ma'at, to continue. But the troubles that were coming would be unlike anything Egypt had faced before. Not an invasion by a single enemy that could be met and defeated, not a dynastic crisis that could be resolved by establishing a new legitimate succession. Not even a period of division that could eventually be reunified. What was coming would test Egypt's resilience in new ways, would disrupt the patterns that had held for so long, would force adaptations that would change Egyptian civilization even as it survived. But on this particular evening, none of that was yet visible. The sun set over the delta, the Nile reflected its light, the great river continuing its eternal flow. The stars emerged, the same stars that had watched over Egypt for millennia. The prayers were offered, the rituals completed, the doors of the temples sealed until dawn, and Egypt, ancient and enduring, continued through another night, secure in its belief in its own permanence, confident in the protection of its gods. The first signs of trouble were small, easy to dismiss as temporary disruptions. A trading ship that should have arrived at an expected time failed to appear. A merchant returning from a voyage reported pirates in waters that had been safe. A letter from a vassal city mentioned raids by unknown attackers. Individually, these incidents were not alarming. Ships sometimes sank in storms. Pirates had always been a problem in certain areas. Raids by mountain tribes or nomadic groups were a predictable annoyance. But the reports continued, and slowly a pattern emerged. The trade routes that had connected the Bronze Age world were becoming less reliable. Ships sailed less frequently, or stayed closer to shore, or avoided routes that had once been routine. Merchants became more cautious, less willing to venture far from home. The flow of goods that had sustained the palace economies began to slow, not dramatically at first, but noticeably. Copper from Cyprus had been a foundation of the Bronze Age economy. The island's mines had been worked for centuries, their output shipped throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But by the late 13th century BCE, some of these mining operations were being abandoned. Whether this was because the most accessible deposits were exhausted, or because the security situation made mining operations too dangerous, is unclear. What is clear is that copper production declined. Tin, always the critical bottleneck in bronze production, became harder to obtain. The long trade routes that brought tin from Central Asia, or wherever the primary sources were located, became less reliable. Merchants who had made careers from this trade found it more difficult and dangerous. Some may have retired, some may have died. The knowledge of routes and the relationships that made long-distance trade possible may have begun to erode. The response to supply problems was predictable. Prices for tin and copper rose. The palaces, which controlled most bronze production, began to hoard metal, restricting its use to essential purposes. Weapons received priority. Tools and vessels might be made in reduced numbers or not replaced when they wore out. Old bronze objects were recycled more carefully, every scrap saved. But recycling could not create new supply. And as the flow of fresh metal declined, the total amount of bronze available began to shrink. This had cascading effects. Fewer bronze tools meant less efficient agriculture and craft production. Less agricultural surplus meant less ability to support non-farming populations in cities. Smaller urban populations meant less demand for trade goods, which further disrupted trade networks. The economic connections that bound the Bronze Age world together were beginning to unravel. Climate may have played a role in these disruptions. There is evidence that the eastern Mediterranean experienced drought in the late 13th century. BCE tree ring data from Anatolia shows reduced growth, suggesting less rainfall. Egyptian texts mention low Nile floods, which would have meant reduced agricultural production. Drought in one region might be manageable, but simultaneous drought across multiple regions would have created widespread problems. Drought leads to food shortages, which lead to movement of peoples seeking better conditions. Farmers might abandon marginal land and move to areas where water was more reliable. Whole communities might migrate if local conditions became untenable. These population movements would put pressure on the areas receiving migrants, straining resources, potentially leading to conflict between established residents and newcomers. The movement of peoples is difficult to track archaeologically. but there are hints in the texts. Letters from this period sometimes mention groups called Habiru or Shasu, people who were outside the normal palace-controlled agricultural economy, sometimes hired as laborers, sometimes appearing as raiders or bandits. Whether these represent displaced farmers, nomadic peoples taking advantage of disrupted conditions, or something else is debated. What seems clear is that there were increasing numbers of people moving through the landscape outside the control of established authorities. In this environment of increasing scarcity and insecurity, the palace systems came under stress. The redistributive economy depended on surplus being collected and stored. If agricultural production declined due to drought or because farmers were fleeing disruption, the surplus available for collection would shrink. The palace would have less to redistribute, meaning less ability to support the craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators who made the system function. The first response might be to squeeze more from the remaining productive population, increase taxes, demand more labor service, requisition more goods. But there are limits to this approach. Push too hard, and farmers might flee, reducing production further. Push too hard, and rebellions might start, requiring military action to suppress, which costs resources and reduces security further. The palace administrations were caught between declining resources and rising demands. We can see the stress in the tablets from Pylos, dating to the final year of the palace. There are records of bronze being collected and redistributed for weapons. There are records of troops being mobilized, defenses being organized along the coast. The palace was responding to a crisis, though the exact nature of the crisis is not stated in the bureaucratic language of the tablets. Something was threatening, something coming from the sea, and the palace was preparing. Similar preparations may have been made at other sites, though we lack the documentary evidence. The massive fortification walls at Mycenae and Tiryns were maintained and possibly strengthened. At Mycenae, an underground cistern was constructed, ensuring water supply during a siege. These were expensive projects requiring substantial labor, suggesting that the threat was taken seriously. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire was experiencing its own problems. Letters from the last Hittite kings show concern about grain supplies. There were requests to Egypt for grain shipments. There were orders to officials in Cyprus and Syria to send grain to the capital. The Hittite heartland may have been experiencing drought, or perhaps the agricultural system was being disrupted by the same factors affecting other regions. The Hittite military was also mobilized in these years. There are records of campaigns, though the details are often unclear. The empire was fighting on multiple fronts, in the west against rebellious vassals or invaders, in the north against groups the Hittites called the Kaska people who lived in the mountains. The army was stretched thin, trying to maintain control of far-flung territories while defending the heartland. One particularly important series of letters from this period comes from Ugarit, the prosperous merchant city on the Syrian coast. In these letters, the king of Ugarit writes to the king of Cyprus about attacks enemy ships have been sighted. Some of Ugarit's own ships have been burned. The city is threatened. The Ugarit king asks for military assistance, for ships, for troops. There is a tone of desperation in these letters, a sense that the situation is serious and deteriorating. The king of Cyprus responds, but he has his own problems. There are raids on Cyprus as well. He cannot spare the help Ugarit needs. Each kingdom is facing its own crisis, and the mutual support that had characterized Bronze Age diplomacy is breaking down. The bonds of alliance are fraying when they are most needed. Who were these raiders? The Ugarit letters do not specify. They are simply the enemy, attackers who come by sea, who burn ships and threaten cities. The lack of specific identification may mean that the people of Ugarit did not know who these attackers were, that they were dealing with enemies whose origins and intentions were unclear. This uncertainty must have made the threat even more frightening. In Egypt, Ramesses II's long reign ended with his death around 1213 BCE. His son, Meremptah, succeeded him and almost immediately had to deal with an invasion from the West groups the Egyptians called Libyans, along with allies the Egyptians called Sea Peoples, invaded the delta. Meremptah defeated them in a battle he commemorated on temple walls, claiming to have killed or captured thousands of enemies. The Sea Peoples mentioned in Meremptah's inscriptions are identified by names that are not certainly understood: Sherden, Shekelesh, Luka, Tersha, Akawasha. Some of these names might correspond to later peoples or places, Sardinians and Sicilians, perhaps, or the Lycians of western Anatolia. But the identifications are tentative, and the origin of these groups is unclear. What is clear is that they were moving, fighting, threatening Egypt's borders. Meremptah's victory stabilized the situation for the moment. The delta was secured, the invaders defeated. But the fact that such an invasion could occur, that groups could gather sufficient force to threaten Egypt itself, was ominous. Egypt had always had to defend its borders, but this seemed different, a larger and more organized threat than the raids by desert nomads that had been a routine problem. The network of Bronze Age diplomacy, which had operated for centuries, was breaking down. Letters from this period show increasingly desperate requests for aid that cannot be provided. Allies who might once have sent troops or supplies are unable or unwilling to do so. The sense of shared interest, of a world order that benefited everyone and therefore deserved mutual support, was eroding. Trade, which had always involved risk, became significantly more dangerous. Merchants who had grown wealthy from Bronze Age trade either retired from the business or lost their investments when ships failed to return. The merchant class, which had been essential intermediaries in the palace economy, may have shrunk. Fewer ships meant fewer goods moving, which meant less revenue from trade, less contact between regions, less cultural exchange. As trade declined, regions became more isolated. Luxuries that had been imported became unavailable. Styles and techniques that had been shared across the Mediterranean became more localized. The cosmopolitan culture of late Bronze Age cities, where Egyptian and Mycenaean and Hittite influences mingled, began to fragment into more distinct regional cultures. The palace scribes, still dutifully recording transactions, may have noticed that the numbers were changing. Fewer copper ingots arriving, fewer tin shipments being distributed to bronze smiths, smaller tax revenues from merchants, reduced numbers of workers in some palace workshops. These statistical changes, recorded in the dry language of bureaucracy, marked a transformation in the underlying economy. For ordinary people, the changes may have been experienced as a slow decline in living standards. Things that had been readily available became expensive or unavailable. Bronze tools wore out and were not replaced, or were replaced with inferior products made from recycled metal of lower quality. Pottery that had been imported might no longer arrive, forcing reliance on local production foods that had come from trade might disappear from markets. The psychological impact of these changes should not be underestimated. The Bronze Age world had offered a kind of security, a predictability based on long-standing patterns. People knew what to expect from the rhythms of trade and agriculture, of religious festivals and palace administration. When these patterns began to break down, when the expected did not happen, when the familiar became unreliable, it must have been profoundly unsettling. In some places, there may have been attempts at local self-sufficiency. Communities might try to produce more of what they needed rather than relying on trade. But the Bronze Age economy was so specialized that this was difficult. A region without copper deposits could not easily start producing bronze. A palace system, built on administration of stored surplus, could not easily adapt to reduced surplus. The complexity that had been a strength became a vulnerability. There were probably increased conflicts over diminishing resources, raids by one community on another's stored grain, disputes over water rights as drought made every source precious competition for trade goods or trade routes. Violence that in better times might have been prevented by strong palace authority, but which in deteriorating conditions could not be adequately policed. The very systems that had enabled Bronze Age prosperity now transmitted the crisis. The same trade networks that had distributed copper and tin could distribute disruption and insecurity. The same administrative systems that had coordinated regional economies could magnify the effects of local problems. The same military forces that had maintained order could be overwhelmed by threats from multiple directions at once. By perhaps 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world was under severe stress. The symptoms were visible across the eastern Mediterranean. Fortifications being strengthened, grain stocks being hoarded, military mobilizations, desperate letters between rulers unable to provide the support being requested. Pirates and raiders operating with increasing boldness, trade declining, prices rising, security deteriorating. The old order was not yet broken, but it was bending. The palaces still stood, the kingdoms still functioned, but the foundations were cracking, the structures under strain, the systems stressed beyond their capacity to adapt, and the worst was yet to come. The disruptions that had begun would soon cascade into catastrophe, bringing down the complex civilization that 3 centuries had built. On a quiet evening in this period of crisis, perhaps at Ugarit or Pylos, at Hattusa, or one of the Egyptian fortresses, someone might have looked out over familiar landscapes and felt unease. The signs were there for those who could read them. The ships that did not return, the reports of attacks, the difficulty obtaining what had once been routine, the sense that the world was changing, that the security that had been taken for granted was slipping away. But life continued. There were still tasks to complete, still harvests to bring in. still children to feed, still duties to perform. The world had faced troubles before and survived. There was no reason, yet, to think this time would be different. The palaces still functioned, the scribes still recorded, the priests still performed rituals, the farmers still planted at the patterns held, even as the forces that would break them gathered strength. The evening light faded over familiar walls, over fields that families had worked for generations, over harbors where ships had been arriving and departing for centuries. Tomorrow would bring another day, more work, more problems to solve, more routines to follow. The people of the Bronze Age world did what humans always do in the face of uncertainty. They continued. They adapted as best they could. They hoped the crisis would pass, that the old patterns would reassert themselves, that the world they knew would persist. But hope, however necessary, is not always enough.